Thank you, Ivo. That was great. Are there any questions for any of the speakers, actually? I see a few in the chat, and for those who can't read the chat, maybe I'll start there to get us started. So there was a question about the difference, going back to the very beginning of the chat thread. There was a question about the difference between linked art and Lido. And I don't know if, Rob, you want to take that question?
Sure, yep. So my experience is that Lido is XML based, but built on top of the same core model of CRM. So it has the notion of events, and it has objects and so forth. But it's not itself a graph. It's a lightweight description of objects, and it's not a lightweight description of people. It's a lightweight description of objects. So I think there's a difference in scope as well as a difference in format. And in the chat, Gudrun said that there should be an RDF representation available for Lido in the future, which I think would be great, because there's the difficulty really is translating between conceptual models, not between different formats that describe the same underlying model. So it's relatively straightforward today to translate between Lido and linked art, or similarly from linked art to Lido. And what's needed is the toolchain to do that, and the profiles for what the data means in those formats, which is where I think linked art will help in terms of the domain, rather than just a more general, here is a format in which you can put data. And then perhaps I'll read the next one. Then Angela asks, did any collection involved in the Van Gogh Worldwide project provide data that had a focus that could not be mapped into linked data right away, such as detailed provenance information or commissioning events, that sort of thing?
So this, the provenance information has two ways of representing. So you could have the event-based way of modeling that. So then you model the events that changes, that models the change of ownership from one party to the other, or you model the party and the period in which the party has the object. So and both ways of modeling are introduced in the collection management system. So you had to calculate the one into the other if you want to use that, but it was doable. There's no way. There was no other example that I can think of that was difficult to calculate.
And Goran asks, it is kind of an aggregation of linked open data. Have you thought about a federated search approach? So at the linked, I think there are two different levels for this, one at the Van Gogh level and one at the linked art level. So I'll answer for linked art first. So linked art has, or is working on, I should say, more of a REST-based API where you ask for the description and you get the description. So we want it to be as simple as possible to implement, so that we get as much implementation as possible. One of the things that we see with things like federated search, be that by a federated Sparkle or other techniques, is that it very quickly leaves people behind. That if you cannot participate at that federated layer, then you don't try to participate at any other layer. Whereas we want instead to enable institutions to do what they can when they can, particularly in this current pandemic environment, and see benefit for that straight away. So we're looking at enabling aggregators to aggregate content, and if institutions want to provide Sparkle endpoints or other sophisticated APIs for interacting with their data, that's wonderful, and aggregators and other partners can use those, but it's not that they are required to participate. But Eva, would you like to speak to the?
Yeah, it's the same here. So eventually there were only two institutions that could participate with a Sparkle endpoint. So all the others, yeah, we had to use REST APIs, and then they would all be different. So then we had to have components that translated the R-linked art question into their API. So that would be more complicated. So yes, eventually, at some point in the future, we hope that we don't have to aggregate data, and then could do a federated query. But for at least a couple of years, I don't believe that will be possible to do.
And maybe we'll take one last question before we transition over to the second half of the session. And this one is coming from John McQuaid about exhibitions. Working with the same exhibition described differently, could a potential fix for that be applied to the medium? Yeah, it's a question that came in last in the chat.
Yeah, I read it. So yeah, so it could be possible that an exhibition by one institute is described differently than the exhibition provided by another institute, and then we have to, well, guess whether it's is the same exhibition. So that's the reason why we want to introduce a authority URI for them to introduce in their system, and then provide us with that disambiguation URI. I don't see could a potential fix for that be applied to the medium. I don't understand it, that example. Maybe Rob, do you?
I wasn't immediately clear about that either, I'm afraid.
Maybe if John is still on the line, he can ask his question live. That might be easier.
If he wants
maybe we can tackle that in the second half of the session, isn't it? Since Rob, you are actually going to demo live data modeling with data from the Rijksmuseum. So we're very excited about that. So hosting powers over to you again, huh?
Mm-hmm. And Edward, if you would like to go first, just to sort of introduce the object,
sure.
And then we'll look at how it gets turned into like that.
Hi everyone, I'm Edward Anderson. I work at the Rijksmuseum. I'm a data manager. I'm responsible for the kind of ETL data pipelines that we have between our CMS and various other systems. And today we're going to be talking about an object, which I'm posting the URI for in the chat right now. I might post a couple of different links. There's a kind of emerging theme about our various linked art demos, is that a lot of them are centered around the work of Georgia O'Keeffe. As a museum predominantly responsible for the preservation of 17th century Dutch artworks, we don't have any Georgia O'Keeffes, but we do have some photographs by her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. So as a kind of meta graph connection there, this is our like extension of a linked art demo. If your URI doesn't automatically dereference to the English version of our website, I'll just also share the English one. And for those who would much rather look at data than images, for you, a special gift of our Lido representation of the public data on that object as well. Cool.
Great. Okay, so we thought that it would be interesting to look at how to go from something that you can see on the web either as a human with the collection view, or as a machine with the Lido view, into the model, and then we don't have an automated way of going from a diagram to JSON-LD. That would be super cool. But you could easily imagine what it would look like as data. Before we get started on that, just some brief notes about the profile. So for folks who are interested or familiar with CRM, again, you'll note that we do not use the E and P with numbers in it, and we've sort of shortened some of the names and completely renamed some of them. This is an attempt to make the format, so the JSON-LD, a bit more usable to developers. And hence, when we talk through this this example, we'll use those names for the properties, but it's easy, trivial, in fact, to translate from the names that we use in JSON through to the actual properties and classes. We also don't use any of the more powerful tools in the CRM toolbox, such as multiple instantiation, because it's much easier to implement if you only have a limited selection of tools, and we've simply found that we didn't need multiple instantiation or any of the more powerful tricks in order to get the job done. So Einstein is famously quoted as saying, as simple as possible, but no simpler. So do only that which you need to do, but if you need to do it, then you need to do it. So we haven't needed to use multiple instantiation, and so we haven't. There also aren't properties on properties. That creates additional headaches and confusion. We've tried to pick the domain and range and which direction the relationship should go. And there's an aspiration, which we stick to as much as we can, to do things exactly one way rather than having multiple ways of doing the same thing. So sometimes we have to allow multiple ways of doing the same thing just because the data only fits into two different patterns. But by and large, it is the exception to have exceptions rather than the norm. So with that, for folks who are familiar with CRM, this may look a little bit different. I assure you it's trivial to go from what you will see in the diagram to the CRM that you're familiar with. So I will share my screen. And I have a pattern library off to the side that I'll be dragging things into this currently blank slate. So, Edward, would you like to pick out the first bit of the record to?
Okay, well, I guess the first thing is you land on a web page and you have a image of a photographic print in front of you. Mm-hmm.
So the thing that we're talking about is the photograph itself.
Yes, exactly. Well, yes.
Being a human-made object. So we can give that a class, which is, I won't put classes on everything because the names on the little bubbles are descriptive of the class. But this would be a human-made object, and we were very grateful to the CRM folks, the SIG, for adopting human-made in version 7 rather than the previous man-made which is a little bit more of a gendered, unnecessarily gendered term in English, though of course less so in other languages. We would also, as we had in the first example, we can have labels associated with everything. And these are primarily for someone looking at the data rather than a machine, so or an end user for that matter. So we prefix it with an underscore just to make it a little bit more obvious that this is something that is there if you're looking at the JSON and not to display directly to the user. So Edward, what's the name of what would be a useful term for the object so that we knew what it was? The portrait van Catherine Stieglitz. And you may be muted.
Yeah, it looks like that's the title for the object.
Yep. Did Edward, are you there still?
I'm not seeing him on the list of panelists anymore.
Maybe lost connection.
Yeah.
Well, we can see the data, so I will continue. Hey, Rio's back. Welcome back.
Sorry, I had technical problems.
No problem. So we put it on the label and the type. What else is there? We could maybe work down the list in the object data.
Sure. So the object has a title. In fact, it has two. We have a title for it in Dutch and a title. Well, I say, no, maybe we only have one. It is in Dutch.
So for the title, we would use the name pattern, and because it's a pattern, we can just simply drop the pattern onto the object. So names, or E33, E41 linguistic appellations, have three core properties. They can have a language. So I guess we're looking at the English version.
We're looking at the Dutch one, sorry.
Oh, sorry, yep. And then it will be classified as the primary name. And it has some content, which I guess is otherwise
the same as the label. Yes.
Yep. And then you could duplicate exactly this with English to have multiple names in different languages. And if there are questions, please do put them into the chat so that we can address them as we're going. Maybe this is all super obvious and easy, but if there's anything that stands out as being interesting or confusing, please do just shout out or indeed put it into the chat, and we can address them as we go. So the next type would be next bit would be the object type, I imagine, of a photograph.
It is a photograph.
Yep.
We don't have a URI for that, so we would want to map to the AAT one.
Yep. So this is then a link out to a vocabulary. So it would be whatever the AAT number for photograph is. And while in CRM it is P2 has type, you had to relabel that in the JSON-LD because the label on this arc is type. And we thought it would be too confusing to have both type and has type, one of which goes to a class and the other one goes to an instance of a type or concept. So instead, we thought classified as is probably a better, a more usable, more understandable label for this particular arc. But underneath it is just P2 has type.
So we have an accession number for this object. We call it an object number, which is a like alphanumeric text string.
Yep. And as one can imagine, identifiers are that same pattern. And I've included all of the information here, all of the structure. So it's an identifier and it has a string PF F17653. So PF F17653. And what sort of identifier is it? It's an accession number. So yes. Again, we'd have AAT, accession number. To distinguish it from other sorts of identifiers. But because the same object could have been accessioned into different organizations over time, we might want to say that this identifier was assigned by a particular institution, the Rijksmuseum. So it's the Rijksmuseum's accession number, or this identifier, which is an accession number, was assigned by an activity, and hence we're getting into this event centricity, which the assignment of that identifier was carried out by the Rijksmuseum. And similarly, a different accession number would still have the same accession number concept, but would be assigned by a different organization.
So we have some creation event metadata, and I don't know how deep we want to go in or how explicit we need to be or can be about the data that we provide, but the photograph was made by Alfred Stieglitz in 1905. I don't know whether I can tell you whether the exact print that we look after was, or whether Stieglitz made that print himself or somebody else did on a negative that he had shot.
Yep. So let's connect. So here is again the basic activity pattern, and in this case it's production. So we'll connect it to the object. It is not just any old activity, it is a production activity. And the relationship from the object to the production is produced by. So that is in linked art a choice that we have made, that the direction should be from the object to the production with produced by, rather than from the production to the object with produced. The reason for that is in looking at the data in our various systems, of course, most existing systems are object-centric rather than event-centric. So there's often an identifier, or more than one identifier, many identifiers for objects, but very rarely is there an identifier for the production of the object. Because the object is only ever produced once, there is a one-to-one relationship between these two things. So in terms of what information you would get when you asked for the object, you get the object, all of this information, and the production along with it. So hence, we've made some choices. We've tried to make it as consistent as possible internally, but at the expense of losing some of the flexibility that we get with CRM. So we can say that the object was produced, we can say that it's by Stieglitz.
Correct.
And we can skip over the fact that it is a print, e.g., it's a photograph. But if we wanted to say that it was produced using a negative, that is a very, of course, common pattern. So we could have a pointer over to another object, which would be, in this case, the negative. And I'll put this in temporarily, but I'll take it out again. So we're just using the existing, very commonly used property or relationship, use specific object. So this activity was carried out by Stieglitz or whoever printed the photograph. It could be classified as photograph printing. So this is called printing. And it used a specific object being the negative of the film. So then we need the time.
Yes, it was made in 1905.
Okay. So again, time is one of these very common patterns that is used everywhere. And we could have said that the attribute assignment was occurred at a certain time, and probably when it was accessioned, but that's not in the record so far. So CRM has a notion of a time span. We could also give it a capital S because it's 2 words, which has the beginning of the earliest possible date and the latest possible date, and then also the latest possible beginning and the earliest possible end of those of the range. So if it was in 1905, then the beginning would be the 1st of January at midnight 1905, and the end, clarified in the most recent CRM SIG, would be, and not up to date in the website, I hasten to admit, would be the very last second of 1905. In the linked out site, you'll see 1906, 0101, 00000. So you would only be wrong by a second if you're doing it the current way. One thing that we have found, though, is that when producing websites or human intended representations, that the date should be displayed as 1905, that we don't want to say it occurred sometime from the very first second of 1905 through to the very last second of 1905. So in order to be as flexible as possible with that, we assign a name to the time span with identified by, which gets a little bit confusing. Apologies for that. This time span has a name, which is a display name. So the name is intended for displaying to end users, and the content of that name is just 1905. So now, as a consuming application, if what you are trying to do is render to a human, all you need to do is pick out that 1905 content and put that for the human. If what you're doing is building a search engine and you want to say what happened at some point during 1905, then you would use this more data-oriented view of the same content. So in one pattern, we can now serve 2 audiences without reproducing all of the knowledge in multiple different ways.
So we have some metadata describing the physicality of the object. It is printed on paper, or it is made of paper.
Yeah.
And we have 2 sets of dimensions, one describing the physical space of the paper, and the other the size of the image within.
So materials types like primariness or displayness or that sort of thing. But instead of being classifications, I think they made a copy, yep. Instead of being classifications, they are related by a different property, which in CRM, I believe is composed of, but we renamed it, much like classified as, to be made of, just to be a bit more obvious as to what is going on. So the physical object is made of paper, and that could be repeated as many times as you want. If it was a more interesting decorative arts object, it could be made of gold and silver and oak and etc. So then the measurements, so we can do the two different forms. There's the descriptive form, just move this out of the way a little bit, which of course is a common pattern, where the full text is described as a linguistic object. So I'll drop that pattern in up here. And again, this follows exactly the same, it's a bit wide. The same sort of pattern as for identifiers and names. Down to there. So the object is referred to by an assertion, a text, a linguistic object, which is in, well, it doesn't really matter, I guess H and W are English, or is it the same in Dutch?
H and D, H and B, sorry. EFO should be helping me.
Yeah. So 207 by 169, I'm at least looking.
That's the shape of the image content inside. The piece of paper is 302 by 210.
Sorry, yep, so H302. MXW210MM. Right, so if you were not familiar with conventions, then that would not tell you much, and we'll get to how a machine can understand that in a second. But this is then, we need to know what sort of text this is in order to build an interesting interface. So remember, of course, we want to say this is measurements, so we would say this is a measurement statement. However, because this type is infinitely extensible, you could have many different sorts of statements about things. We then introduce a meta type to say that this type has a type, and it is what sort of text it is. So this is fixed, and then there can be many of these. So this gives us another pattern whereby we can make it easier for consuming applications and consuming developers to understand what's going on by having fixed points, regardless of what the vocabularies are used here. So if you had a statement that was not one of the ones that are commonly used, then an application, if it saw this type of text, would at least be able to sort of throw up the label for it and the content, and a human user would be able to understand what's going on, even if the system didn't know what, let's say, provenance statement was meaning. So, however, if we wanted to be able to search using those dimensions, sure would be nice if they were expressed as data rather than as text, because parsing out H302MM from that string would be painful. I'll just move over here. So there is a structure for dimensions, which has this tripartite value. It's got the actual numeric value. And in CRM, the value of dimensions can be anything, including strings. In linked art, we reduce that functionality to be only numbers. They can be floating points or they can be integers, but they have to be numbers. You can't put a string in there. We would then use 80 millimeters as the unit, and it's classified as the height. Burke asks in the chat, is there any concept of order in case there are multiple similar properties, like an object being made primarily out of one material, but also of another, and can such a hierarchy be preserved? So technically, no. If you had 5 different measurement statements, because it's a graph, they all simply relate the object and the statement. And there's no sort of, in the structure, there isn't a way of saying this is the primary one. However, at the ontology, at the vocabulary layer, we have these guys, primary. So the object is identified by a name, in Dutch, Portrait van Kaplan Stieglitz, which is classified as the primary name. It might have another name, which was not primary, which could be a photograph of the wife of the photographer, which is not a good name, clearly, because it doesn't name the person in the photograph. So in that case, it wouldn't be the primary name. And well, let's just change the second one, right? So portrait of wife of Stieglitz, a terrible, terrible name. And then that would be alternate. So instead of having an order, we simply have a more binary distinction of primariness and non-primariness. If there is a real order of things, such as, it's mostly oak with then some silver and then little bits of diamond, we can't deal with that in the current patterns. That's a great question, and one that comes up frequently. It's a challenge of the graph structure or graph model, underlying model, that it does not preserve order. One approach that some folks have taken, it's not official, but it's certainly useful, is in the serialization in the JSON to put them in the right order, such that the primary ones are first and then following on to alternate ones and so forth, because the naive user interface won't process it as a graph. It will simply process it in the order that it sees it, and hence it will put them in the correct order for the human, even if that is a side effect of the JSON rather than the actual model.
Do you want to do the other dimensions? Or do you want another data type?
Well, we've done dimension, so let's go on and look at some of the...
Okay, so the photograph has some subject. It is a photograph of his daughter, Catherine. And also we have a statement from icon class that a woman is depicted.
Yep, that's right. Let me just
dig out the code for that.
So here is one of the interesting and core differences between linked art and CRM and some other existing patterns, which is that we separate out the physical object from the image or textual content that it is carrying. Because especially for photographs, there could be many photographs, each of which show exactly the same image. So there's no point having one newly catalogued piece of image content for each copy of the photograph, when in a graph, we can refer to that's the same image many times. So that is an information object and indeed a visual item. And I'm starting this over here because, let me just briefly zoom out. All of this information that we've done so far comes in a package. So all of this, despite whether it's got internal identifiers or links externally, this data will come when you ask for the object record. So this is one API endpoint, essentially. You'll get all of this. But because there can be multiple objects, each of which refers to the same visual or textual content, the description of the visual content is separate. So instead, you would ask for the objects record. You would then follow a link to the description of the image or the text or the audio, when we get to audio in CRM, that the object bears. And we'll see this as being also important when we get to digital. Well, let's just throw in digital now anyway, because the digital object also shows that same image. And clearly there can be many, many digital objects, each of which shows the image, same image as the object. So hence this split, which is maybe less familiar to folks. Okay, so here we are at the visual item. We would also give it a class visual item. We would want to give it a label, image of, shown by the portrait of Catherine Stieglitz, but we'll skip over them. So it then the image represents a person being Stieglitz, and of course it's not Stieglitz the father, but Stieglitz the daughter.
And we have the icon class code 61BB2.
Yep. So K Stieglitz. And visual items can represent anything. So it could represent a person, it could represent another object, it can even represent conceptual things. However, the woman one is a subject. It's about historical people. Or there is in linked art another property which is not present in CRM, at least in 6.7. I forget whether we had it in 7 or not, which is represents entity of type. A little bit of a mouthful, but essentially images can represent entities. So this is the Catherine Stieglitz. But if we don't know who it is, if we just knew that there was a woman depicted, we would say it represents an entity of type woman. So it would, when you've got the subject of historical person's woman, is it about a woman or is it depicting an entity of type woman?
We have it in a Lido subject wrap.
Right. Okay. So it would be more of the aboutness. But it could just be a different a difference of the various ontologies, that's simply not possible to differentiate between the two in Lido. But yeah, let's do about for now. It looks like we're down to acquisition.
Yeah, we acquired the photograph in 1994.
So an easy thing to say, but as rights are involved, and there is a lot of interest in understanding the history of objects, much like visual content is separate and digital objects are separate, provenance activities are also separate in linked art. So let me just move these guys down out of the way a little bit. So in linked art, because there's different types of things which happen during provenance events, the object could be acquired, e.g. the rights, the ownership rights are transferred between organizations or between actors. The object is often physically, but not always, moved. If you acquire a painting, probably you're going to want to put it in your museum. If you acquire a 10-ton statue, maybe you just leave it where it is, and hence there wouldn't be a move. You also probably acquire custody, legal and physical. So rather than multiple instantiation, which is confusing and complicated to implement, instead we use the CRM pattern of partitioning. So there is a provenance activity overall, and it has multiple parts. In this case, the one that we are interested in is the acquisition of ownership, or the acquisition, which is the transfer of ownership. So it transfers title to the Rijksmuseum.
And we don't publish who it was transferred from, but we almost certainly will have that data.
Yep. So in the back end, this may be available, but not for public consumption. Again, we can reuse this same. I'll just grab the template. Time span pattern to say when the acquisition occurred. And because the different parts of the provenance might have occurred at different times, and we only want one way to do it if at all possible, we'll attach it to the acquisition rather than the sort of wrapper activity. And you acquired it in 1994, which is sometime between the very first second and the very last second of the year. And because we want to be nice to consuming interfaces, we'll put 1994 as a display name for it. So provenance activity is just an E7 activity. It's got a classification hanging off of it, which is provenance. So that when you encounter this thing, you know that it's a provenance activity without having to look at the different parts and saying, okay, there's an acquisition as part of it, so it's probably a provenance activity. No, it's explicitly one. Emmanuel, how are we doing for time?
We have 13 minutes left.
Are there any questions? Would people like us to?
Question, yeah. About the order or about materials, and if one is the primary material over others, is there a way to keep that hierarchy?
Yep. Yeah, I answered that one already when I saw it come up. But yeah, briefly, not directly in the format. We use the sort of primary and alternate pattern. Or in the serialization, we can have order because you need to write things down in a particular order, but it's not encoded directly in the graph. Graphs with ordering are immensely complicated, and the sort of bipartite primary alternate structure, which you can apply to many different things, seems to work just as well for the use cases that we've run into at the very least. Are there any other questions? Prefer to leave time for discussion rather than more mapping performance art. Feel free to unmute. Can people just directly unmute? Or raise your hand if that's easier. Descriptive materials and techniques can be handled like measurements. Yes, exactly correct. So we said that it was made of paper, but we could very easily have used a material statement instead of measurement statement. So we would simply take this, put it over here, and relink it. Apologies for the mock crossing lines. So the statement might be printed on photographic paper, which a human would be quite capable of understanding, but a machine is more likely to want to let us know that the object was made of this identified thing, paper. Can you link particular material and technique applied to the material? So the paper was printed, but well, that's not, it's a bit hard to do with photograph when there's only one material. The silver was inlaid and the oak is the main structure. What about a painting? A frame is made of oak and the support is made of canvas. Is that, and then the canvas is painted on. Is that the use case? Or is that a reasonable facsimile of the use case? If so, then yes, because we follow partitioning. So let's do the support. So we would say there is an object, which is still a human-made object, which is part of this one. So this object has part this object, and this object is, I'm going to really, well, let's say it's a framed photograph. And this is the frame because the rest of it's paper. So the frame is made of oak, and it is a frame. So made of oak, classified as frame. Carving is the tech applied to marble. Oh, so let's say that the oak is carved. That's an interesting one. So then, because the carving is an activity, we would need to talk about the production of the frame. So the frame is produced by a production, and the production has a particular technique, which is carving. So in the same way that the production is classified as printing over here, this production would be classified as carving. There we go, that's a good question, thank you. Yeah, and it brings up this the split that we have, that we've already used, that we want to be as consistent as possible in our approach to things, so that people aren't surprised when they see particular properties. So in the same way that we've partitioned the activity, all of the different parts of provenance, one of which is acquisition, there might be different parts to the object, one of which is the frame, which is made of oak. And now, oh look, you could repeat all of these different things. You know, the frame has dimensions, the frame has statements about it, the frame might have an identifier, it certainly has a classified as, it's got made of, it's got produced by, and so on. So by then, then we can sort of draw some boxes around things, which let me just quickly do that, to say, here is something that you would get all of this in one representation. So you would, when you request the provenance activity, you would get all of that data. But you wouldn't get all of this even though it's the transfer of ownership of this object. When you request the frame, you would only get the information about the frame because it is itself a thing. And it could be referred to from other objects as well, right? You could have a collection of interesting oak frames. People, all of the people and actors generally are separate representations. Yes. You don't embed all of the information about the Rijksmuseum in the provenance, otherwise it would get very, very, very messy. The visual item, again, is a separate representation. So you'd get back this bit, oops, sorry, that bit. And the digital objects are separate as well because they might be referred to for multiple things. They could depict multiple objects. And then there'll be more information about the digital object. You know, it's a AAAF image, it's CC0, it's this many pixels high or this many pixels wide, and so on and so forth. And then all the rest of this that I didn't draw a box around, that's the sort of the core object record that you get back when you dereference the object. Yes, and as Manuel says in the chat, please, if you would like to do this sort of activity with your data, please do come along on to our Wednesday session at 4:15, because that's exactly what we would like to do. You know, Edward and I have talked about this one already, so we knew we pre-selected one to have a good range of information, but one that is pretty a set of use cases that are pretty common. So if you would like to do it and see us do this sight unseen, we would be super happy to help out. And also we have mapping calls every other Wednesday at 11 Eastern, which is 4 p.m. in the UK, 5 p.m. in Europe, to which people would be very welcome to bring their examples and questions and use cases. And on the other Wednesday at the same time, we go into more of the interesting questions that often arise from those mapping exercises, such as, in this case, we talked about title on object. How do you make it clear that the name Portrait van Catherine Stieglitz is actually written on the object, in this case on the back? So we talked about how to model that. Was there no, another question?
And I might just briefly add that probably the easiest way for people to join both of those calls, the mapping one and the modeling one, is probably to get on the Linked Art mailing list. It's fairly low traffic. You can find the details on the Linked Art website, and an agenda reminding people that those calls are coming up, along with the connection details, always comes through on those lists.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, we try to give at least a day or two's notice for the agenda. Sometimes we don't make that and it's the same day, but it's always the same Zoom call. I'll stop sharing. Any other questions or comments or thoughts from anyone? I see that some folks have had to leave, but thank you for staying with us. I hope it was useful and interesting.
Thank you very much.
Maybe let's recap just one more time that the next Linked Art session will be tomorrow at 4:15 for an hour. And that's very much a joint working group meeting with the SCARM colleagues, which will be a little bit more of a discussion. Please join in. This will very much be kind of a meet and greet session, as well as, talking about issues that are relevant for both working groups. We want to work in collaboration, as we've done so far. So that's the plan for tomorrow. And then, as I've mentioned in the chat, there will be another linked art mapping session on Wednesday at 4:15 again.
Sure.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for our speakers. That was great. And this will be available on the web very soon, on the CIDOC website, as well as the linked art website, I'm sure.